Thanks for everyone for coming today. We're here today because the village of Lakemoor decided to treat my client like a piece of equipment as opposed to a human being that became damaged as a result of a heroic act of courage and bravery while protecting the citizens of Lakemoor. What happened in this case is a tragic example of a systemic problem in law enforcement, and it's a two-folded problem. And the problem is that that departments are not equipped to provide quality nor the quantity of mental health services for police officers. And it also speaks to the endemic problem of police officers being fearful of reporting their mental problems to their department for fear of retaliation. What happens is everybody loses in those scenarios. These police officers are experiencing mental health issues as a result of their work dealing with the public, and especially in today's day and age where there's so much disdain for the profession in general. So police officers are either going on disability or exercising a right to take time off to work with their mental health, but if they don't meet a certain criteria by a certain amount of time, they're terminated. So what's happening is police officers are not being honest. And who loses in that situation? We do as the public, because we have police officers that are working with mental health issues that are not being treated, not being disclosed, and that leads to what we've seen recently, a horrific increase in suicides amongst police officers. It's led to serious alcohol problems, and quite frankly, it leads to use of force situations that are not proper, because these police officers are dealing with something, mental health, and they're essentially overreacting to situations based upon this condition that they have. So the purpose of this lawsuit is really, it's to correct the stigma behind law enforcement and mental health, and it's also to let departments put them on notice that there's proper ways to treat somebody, not only by the law, but just in fairness. You know, we have to treat these police officers like human beings and provide them with the accommodations, not only that the law requires, but that common decency requires, and treat them like human beings. So with that being said,
Dan, could you spell your name and title for the camera?
Yeah, Dan, D-A-N, Herbert, H-E-R-B-E-R-T, of Herbert Law Firm.
And now Brianna, and if you could spell your name. And Brianna went by her married name in the complaint. If you notice, it's different, but she does professionally go by Brianna Tedesco. But
Do you?
you could
Yes.
spell
Okay.
it.
Yes, Brianna, B-R-I-A-N-N-A, Tedesco, T-E-D-E-S-C-O.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sorry.
In the sense of brevity for broadcast, do you have a preference? Because I think that there's a lot of important information here. So if I can cut out a line that says Brianna Tedesco, who is going by Brianna McCarty in the complaint, what would you prefer if I were to pick one name?
Tedesco.
Tedesco, okay.
So Brianna, you want to say something, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Yes, the major point with this case is to get the help that the officers need. I have an opportunity here to speak on behalf of a community of law enforcement officers struggling with mental health but are afraid to seek treatment and speak to their department about what they're experiencing for fear of retaliation.
And we'll just open it up for questions.
Brianna, prior to the incident that caused you to go to your supervisor, had you felt any mental health concerns, and did you keep those mental health concerns kind of private?
I was involved in an accident on duty in April, just before the shooting, and I was experiencing some anxiety returning to the street, and I was open and honest with the department about that. But it was quickly handled with a few shifts back to the street.
Some of us, I'm reading this now for the first time. It's a long lawsuit. There's a lot of details. So the issue is that you wanted to remain on light duty rather than going full duty, and explain the lead up to you losing your job.
Sure. So my goal was to return to active patrol, and I did my best to do that. But I did realize on the street that I was faced with a lot of triggers, and I needed further mental health treatment. And so with that, my doctor had requested a light duty status, and I was working towards returning to full-time on patrol.
In the light duty, if I can, there's a number of accommodations that Brianna requested, which were very reasonable. She requested that she work a day shift. She even had a fellow officer agree to trade and go to her night shift, and she could work her day shift. That was denied. She asked to work with a partner. That was denied. She worked inside. She has to work a shorter shift, and that was denied. She worked inside, as a lot of police officers do, and how they handled that was she worked inside, did clerical work for the police department, and then she started training a civilian, and 2 weeks later, after the civilian was trained by Brianna, she was fired.
But you were okay with working light duty until you were ready to...
Absolutely.
Okay.
To add to what Dan said, there were several trainings that I also requested. Critical incident for stress management and ground fighting for women that I thought would tackle some of my triggers and PTSD symptoms, and those were also denied.
At what point did you become aware?
Immediately that night, I went to the washroom, and I had opened the shower curtain to make sure there was no one hiding in the shower, which is not something I would normally think to do. When I went to wash my hands, I saw that the shower curtain was half closed. I could not see what was beyond the other half of that shower curtain, and I was afraid. I kind of lost it at that point because I knew what was setting in my mind and my body, and I didn't have control over that. And I began to feel everywhere I went there was someone waiting to kill me, essentially. Every traffic stop I made after that, my immediate thought was, I'm going to die today. This traffic stop will result in my death. And that was one of the biggest things. There are a lot of triggers that I felt, loud noises, women screaming, being in the dark, which I still have trouble with today, being alone. Those all were pretty immediately noticeable.
You said that night, you mean the night of the incident?
So
the shower thing is after that, it's that same night?
it was at 3 a.m. Friday morning. The shooting happened on a Thursday morning. 3 a.m. the next morning is when.
Brianna, can I ask you a question that touches kind of on the emotional element, but then also the culture? Were you ever experiencing, times in your duty where even not addressing mental health concerns that you might have, but even just going back and saying to others on the force, man, this experience I had was awful. Did you ever feel that you would get, some sort of pushback or anybody acknowledging that something might not be a good experience for you?
I think as first responders, we're faced with a lot of tough situations. So we can all say that we've seen something that was sort of traumatic for us. Cases involving children, there are many situations. We are typically open with some of our partners that, hey, this was a tough call. But I never anticipated any pushback.
Okay, so the second part of it, and maybe you addressed this already, but did you ever feel anxiety building in you about something that you wanted to say, but you held back from saying, some concerns about your own mental health that you just kept to yourself and didn't bring forward?
I've never personally kept any feelings to myself. Even through this whole process, I've been really open because that was the only way for me to receive help and address my mental health if I had any.
Yeah,
And if I can, just on that point, if you don't mind, you know, Brianna was a very well-liked, productive police officer before this incident happened. After this incident happened, she was still well-liked, but the behavior started to change on the part of her supervisors and her male coworkers. It's a department with Brianna was only one of two people, and I don't know what happened or why it happened, but they started to target her and really discriminate against her because of this mental illness. And I can only think that it's out of fear on their part that they would react in a similar manner that Brianna did, because there's no other explanation. But they started telling her, you know, you got to get over this, you got to suck it up, pull up your big girl panties, you got to deal with this. And it really is just typical of a kind of a bravado police officer mentality. And it was displayed in a really classic setting in this case.
Brianna, could you also tell them about what they did with not answering the backup calls and some of the other retaliation?
Yeah, so when I would make traffic stops when I returned to work, it's typical for your partner to head your direction when you make a traffic stop unless you advise them they are not needed. I knew I was uncomfortable making traffic stops, and so I never called my backup off. However, they wouldn't show. When I questioned a specific officer about that, I was told, you'll just have to learn that you're okay. And had that been the mentality of my partner that night, the situation may be very different for me. There were several instances, suspicious auto, suspicious person, wanted subject, where I was left without backup.
So you were making traffic stops on light duty? Is that what you're saying?
No, so there was a period in time where I tried to return to work, and when I realized my struggles, we requested light duty then.
I don't want to keep answering questions about this stuff, but I do have a follow-up question. So what's confusing to me, first of all, I'm embarrassed to say, I don't know where, I've never heard of Lakemoor. That's on me. So is this a case of this being a small police department? I mean, based on the facts, the underlying facts, what this gentleman did, human teeth, all this stuff, is it just a situation where it just hadn't dealt with something, with a suspect of this horrendous, you know what I'm saying, right?
Right. Well, I have a couple thoughts on that. I would see where you would make that conclusion. Lakemoor is a small department, and I was the first shooting that Lakemoor had had. However, the command staff came from a large department and should have had the knowledge and the resources to provide me with proper accommodation and help.
And how many officers are there in the police department?
When I was there were 12 full-time sworn.
And you were the only woman?
There's one other female.
Can I ask really quickly, what is being asked for in monetary terms, but then also going back to what you opened with your statement opening, do you hope that this lawsuit sets some sort of precedent for policy to be brought in, because law enforcement agencies will be well aware that something like this could happen again if they don't properly address?
Yeah, when Brianna came to me, I explained some limitations and challenges with this lawsuit, and I asked her what she was looking for, and her answer was clear back then, and it has not changed. And she wants this case to serve as an example of how police officers or any employee should not be treated. She does not want anyone to go through the situation that she went through. And again, the individuals at the other end of the lawsuit here, I don't believe they did this out of spite towards Brianna, but they did it out of ignorance and negligence, and quite frankly, I'm sure the bean counters kind of pushed them in this direction, and it was unlawful, but more than that, it's just very inhumane.
If I can address something you said in your question, the fear shouldn't be of a lawsuit for these departments. It should be their officers struggling with mental health and the suicide rate among first responders.
Can you talk for a moment about what it felt like for you to go from being hailed as a hero to the situation you're in now?
It was devastating. I come from a family of law enforcement. This has always been what I wanted to do. It was my dream. And I've said it before, but my dream was cut short, and it wasn't by the man in that vehicle that night. This was everything I wanted. It was my identity. It was my DNA. So it was devastating to have been fired.
You know, if I can, on that point, Brianna went in a very short time period from a local and even a national hero. She was provided so many awards on a national basis, and more importantly, the village propped her up as the greatest example of a police officer, and what a wonderful act of bravery one of their employees did. And then a year later, they fire her. It was all lip service.
Are you capable of talking about that night and what you had to deal with, or is that going to trigger stuff in you?
Well, I have talked about it, so we can go over it again.
Yeah, I'm just kind of curious. I mean, how big was this guy? You wrestled him, or is that, again, I've just skimmed through this
Right.
20 minutes or so.
So he remained in his vehicle the entire time. When he realized that I was aware he gave me a fake identity, he pulled a firearm from his door pocket and through the car window put it to my head. I pushed that firearm into his lap and fought for it because that was my immediate reaction. Before it fired, I needed to get it away from my head. So we fought for the firearm, and I looked at him and I said, "Give me the gun, I'll let it go, and I'll walk away." And he said, "No, you let go of the gun." And I said, "No, I'm not doing that." And we continued to fight, and he was very strong. I had the thought that if I pulled my firearm, it's fully operational. If he gets it, he will shoot me. I tried to call on my radio, which I kept on my shoulder, to signal for a man with gun, but he pulled my arm and I was unable to key up. So we continued to fight for the gun because I thought that that was my only chance of staying alive, waiting for my partner to arrive. As we were fighting for the firearm, I saw a figure walking towards me. It was dark, I couldn't make it out, but I eventually made out that there was a firearm pointed at the driver. It was my partner. Once I saw that, I disengaged, I pulled my firearm, and my partner shot him. The part that, for some reason, I always forget is he did have a second firearm, and that was missed also in a lot of news articles. Right before I disengaged, he pulled a second revolver from the same location.
How long did this whole incident roughly?
The physical tussle I had with him lasted 26 seconds. The traffic stop in total, I don't know.
And you knew nothing about his background at this point?
I knew nothing.
And are you still experiencing these triggers?
I am. I've made significant improvements, but there's no cure all. It doesn't happen overnight. I am still actively in therapy, and
not working at this point?
I know I'm in school right now,
For what?
psychology.
What is your therapist recommended at this point?
Well, she's recommending that I continue therapy. She has continued looking for resources for me. She sent me to a therapy in Baltimore. It's called a stellate ganglion block. There is a bundle of nerves close to your spine essentially, that is responsible for fight or flight. And so I have received that treatment and have continued making progress. So she just recommends that I continue on the same path.
Can I make a brief summary, just to make sure I've got this correct? You can either acknowledge it or say that I'm wrong in some aspect and correct me. But going back to the piece of equipment instead of a human, it seems to me me from listening to you that you served your duty in your position, you experienced some incidents that had an impact on you and your abilities to work at your highest level, and you were very open about it, brought those concerns. Some attempts were made to address those concerns, but then when your progress in returning to your full capacity and comfort level didn't meet the expectations of the department in terms of maybe the speed of your recovery, that's when they decided to terminate you.
I would agree with that.
Okay. And I had one last question, just in case. But I forgot.
I'm a sports guy, and I link it to very similar to NFL owners before these concussion protocols took place, where NFL owners were profiting off the backs of these warriors, and then they would come back with with complaints about head trauma, and they turned their back on them and said, "Sorry, you're of no use to us anymore." And that's really kind of the way I see this happening with Brianna.
What was the reason, the rationale why the chief gave for terminating her?
Very interesting. He said the explanation was that she's terminated because she has PTSD, but we don't believe that she's disabled. Very circular argument.
But the EOC ruled in her favor.
Yeah.
That she was.
I did remember my question, and this is my final question. I apologize, but I really want to understand this. Do you feel, in your recovery efforts, you mentioned you're still going to therapy.
Mhm.
Do you feel that being terminated has caused even more significant trauma in your recovery? Having that, I know, I've been fired before. It feels awful, especially when you don't feel that you've been fired for the right reasons. Do you think that compounds your recovery at all?
Absolutely. I think my entire time trying to receive help and being retaliated by my department caused a secondary trauma. And, we in the law enforcement community view our partners as family, and so it made it that much deeper to me.
So the legal rationale, just from your explanation, I mean, he fired her because she had PSD, whatever, post-traumatic stress syndrome, and they didn't believe it. I mean, can you explain that from a legal rationale why that's wrong?
Yeah, from a legal rationale, we filed a suit based on a violation of the Americans with Disability Act. And to qualify as a person under the ADA, you have to have a disability that's recognized by the federal courts. PTSD is certainly one of them. As a way of, I guess, defending themselves, they acknowledged that they fired her for PTSD, but they said that she couldn't perform the functions of the job, which is part of the reason why she was fired, without any explanation as to what it was. So essentially they're saying she's not a qualified individual under the ADA.
To turn this around just a little bit, I see, is this a stack of thank you cards from people that you've dealt with in the field?
Some of them I have not met, but yes, it's a stack of thank you cards from the community members and also from a class of students.
Would you like to share, what do you look back on as your proudest moment in law enforcement?
I would say those thank you cards. I've touched a lot of people and I was able to make them, if you look through them, they say thank you. I can sleep at night knowing that you're on the street, and you become a police officer to help people and make them feel safe, and I think that's what I did.
Have you had anything on this close to what you experienced that night? I mean, what was the most serious, anxious moment as a police officer before that?
Before that was the vehicle accident.
Okay. That was in July.
Yeah.
And how long have you been in the force?
A little over 2 years.
2 years. And nowhere before that?
I was with the Darien Police Department for a short period before that.
Okay.
Everybody else set? Okay, thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank
And
you.
there's just some of her awards, the letters, some photos of her, Brianna getting awards, and extra copies of the complaint if you guys need it.
Thank you.
Oh, no.
We're verbose today.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
I did a great job.
I live in the West.
Oh, so do I. Where are you at?
Okay, Halston and Adams.
Okay, I'm at Carpenter, between Randolph and Washington, across from the South headquarters.
That